All central banks around the world are working to implement a central bank digital currency, a CBDC. At the same time, we have watched as more and more people have fallen into poverty. We are looking at examples of a UBI, Universal Basic Income, being implemented in different pilot projects in locations around the world as well. I'm going to tell you why these two will likely be connected, why most people around the world will not only ask for a central bank digital currency, but they will beg for it. I'll explain that here and in the next video in this three-part series. It's important that we pay close attention to what has happened previously. Once we understand that every cycle we have events that seemed impossible just prior, and yet they implemented them and they posed it as a solution. Let's look back in the pages of history, and I will tell you several examples in which they said, this couldn't happen, this won't be done, and yet it did. And in the next video, we are going to talk about what that implementation of the next instance will likely look like, and why it will be quite dystopian. Let's begin here. 2008 financial crisis. The government stepped in to bail out major institutions deemed too big to fail, such as car companies, banks, and housing giants like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. This was unprecedented in its scale and scope. If you remember, if you read the quotes or any books on this topic, you would know the TARP, T-A-R-P bailout. The number at which they came to was literally just out of a hat. There was no real decision behind how big the bailout should be. They chose a number and went with it. The central bank, at the same time, the Federal Reserve, they started indiscriminately printing money like they've never done before. This never happened. There was never a bailout on this scale, and money was given out to places we are still, to this day, unsure of. 2020, the crisis, everybody was locked down. Well, the Federal Reserve created a novel facility to buy corporate bonds, including those of major corporations like Apple. Specifically, they were buying the ETFs based on that. And so indirectly, the biggest companies in the world like Apple, they were receiving a bailout in this way. The move was designed to provide liquidity to companies and stabilize the corporate bond market. The way they did this was tricky. You see, they're not allowed to. The Federal Reserve cannot actively go in and buy bonds of corporations. It is not in their requirements and their abilities. They are supposed to have price stability. They're supposed to be able to maintain inflation, not buying bonds in the way that they are. But they use the Treasury and work together with them, forming this facility and essentially doing just that. This was impossible just prior to its implementation, and yet they did it. The next time around, understand that they could start doing this with stocks. Other countries do this, like China. And it wouldn't surprise me to see them actually doing so inside the stock market the next cycle. Future possibilities. Each crisis tends to open the door for measures that might have been politically or economically unfeasible before. For instance, the idea of a universal basic income has gained traction. While only tested in small scale around the world, a significant economic downturn could push governments to adopt such measures more widely. You got to think about this. They couldn't do that before, and yet here we are discussing it. And looking at it, it seems more and more likely each and every day. Crises are often catalysts for change, and governments and institutions could be on board with that. So we need to look at how they're doing this and how they might deploy that in the face of these future challenges? I think it's important to understand that in detail. Let's talk further into this. There was the unprecedented monetary policy measures. We saw the Fed buying corporate bonds, including the quote unquote fallen angels, which were the companies that have recently downgraded from investment grade to junk status. They went in and bought that up. And other companies like BlackRock said, we are going to copy what the Fed does. And they were, essentially being able to profit very handsomely from this. Many central banks introduced or expanded their quantitative easing programs, buying government bonds and other assets at an unprecedented scale. They did this far beyond anything we've ever seen before. And they did so, including, think about this, the mortgage-backed securities. They were buying mortgage-backed securities while the real estate market was absolutely on fire, moving up every single day. And yet they were buying the mortgage-backed securities. It was unusual. No need for it. Interest rates were at rock bottom, but they did it anyway. There really wasn't a really good excuse to be buying those mortgage-backed securities, and yet they did so. Massive fiscal stimulus. Many countries, including the US, Canada, and the UK, sent direct cash payments or stimulus checks to citizens. Germany enacted its largest post-war aid package, breaking with its tradition in fiscal prudence. They went away from that, just like all the other countries. In Canada, there's something called CERB, which, if you qualified, you would get $2,000. That was because this was a challenge. This was something we never had before. Sign on the dot, and here's your $2,000. Remember, each and every time, this seemed impossible just prior. CERB was essentially the first implementation of UBI. If you qualified, you got your money. Now they can widen that out. It was, to some, considered as a beta test. Loan and grant programs. The Paycheck Protection Program, or the PPP, in the US provided forgivable loans to small businesses to incentivize them to keep employees on the payroll. And we saw this, and by the way, forgivable loans means you get the money and you don't have to give it back. And so we saw that. Every company seemed to be getting these, or at least the ones that didn't need it. In many cases, we looked at celebrities and their big companies where they were making a lot of profit. They didn't necessarily need it. They took that money, and some were rewarded for doing so, it seemed. Australia's job keeper payments subsidize wages to help businesses retain employees. So it goes without saying that every country seemed to be doing one thing or another. I'll look at a few other examples here. Just wanted to explain how we go through this. In the next video, we are going to look at the implementation of the next level. But understanding the past helps us to see how that will take place. Eviction moratoriums and rent relief. Several countries, including the US and parts of Europe, temporarily banned evictions to prevent homelessness during the 2020 timeframe. Some regions also offered rent relief or subsidies. And this was widespread. We saw this everywhere. It wasn't just one city or another. And many people had really been suffering during that period. At the same time, landlords were suffering because they didn't have the rent coming in. So a lot of them had to sell. And it was coming at a time when there was high demand. Maybe they ended up okay in that respect. But for some, this was their business. And so now they don't have any income. It was really something that we've never seen before. Travel restrictions, quarantine measures. Many countries imposed international and in some cases domestic travel restrictions, a measure not widely seen since the Spanish flu of 1918. We had mandatory quarantine measures for international travelers. Some countries, like New Zealand and Australia, instituted actual managed isolation in hotels. Canada, other places did this. And people were simply locked down. Just understand, again, that this was very unique historically. Economic support for specific sectors. France provided substantial support for its domestic airline industry. Italy nationalized its flag carrier, Alitalia, and in response to what happened with the fallout, and of course, one by one, we look at this and have to say, okay, well, what does this mean? Well, that's what brings me to this next one. Digital health passports. Some countries and airlines began developing and implementing digital health passports to verify the test results or the particular status of that traveler. And you start to realize that this was, of course, never expected. And it made people go onto a different level, a whole different level, without saying too much, of course. Deferred loan payments. Financial institutions in various countries offered deferred loan payments for mortgages and other types of loans to provide relief to borrowers. And now we understand the last one here, that we had these universal basic income trials. While the idea predates 2020, we had the renewed interest in UBI, and Spain, for instance, fast-tracked a form of UBI aiming to reach the country's poorest families. And you could see that that was just one example. CERB was only for those who were unemployed, and it was a form of welfare, a social assistance. But that was just a test, a beta test for potentially what could come. And now we have these other examples. We can look at it and realize that a crisis is needed for the implementing of something so big, so life-changing. I can tell you what this rollout will look like. Tune in to the next video.